Marcus Johnson stood rigid in the courtroom, his broad military shoulders straight despite the ill-fitting suit that hung loosely on his now much thinner frame. At 45 years old, his face bore the deep lines of someone who had lived through the horrors of war, someone who had seen too much. His mind flashed back to the countless memories from his 3 tours in Afghanistan, each one more visceral than the last. The quiet hum of the courtroom's air conditioning seemed distant as he stood, lost in thought. The courthouse clock ticked loudly, a sharp reminder of the moment. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the world was moving forward. But Marcus felt as though he was still stuck in the past, tethered to the ghosts of war. The courtroom, though sparsely populated, felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in on him. He could feel the eyes of the few people present boring into his back. A couple of other veterans sat in the back of the room, their faces tired but sympathetic. They knew. They understood. Yet, Marcus kept his gaze forward, fixing it on the bench where Judge William Harrison would soon sit. His military training kicked in and he refused to let his emotions show. The door to the courtroom creaked open and Judge Harrison entered. The judge, a man of 60 with a reputation for being by the book, walked with the kind of controlled pace that came from decades of experience. His black robes flowed behind him like the weight of his authority. Harrison was a man who had presided over thousands of cases, a man known for his impartiality, but also his unyielding adherence to the law. He adjusted his reading glasses as he settled into his seat, flipping through the file before him. For him it was just another Tuesday morning, another case to process. But for Marcus this was more than just another case. This was his life. Case number 2024 County Route 789. State versus Marcus Johnson, the court clerk called, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Marcus felt a twinge in his chest, but he remained still like he had been trained to do. He could hear the shuffle of papers as his court-appointed lawyer, David Chin, stood up beside him. Chin was young, only 3 years into his practice, and Marcus could see the nervousness in his attorney's posture. He had the air of someone who knew this case was far from routine. "Your Honor," Chin began, his voice steady, though Marcus could hear the slight tremor. "My client, Marcus Johnson, is a veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He has been diagnosed with severe PTSD by the VA hospital. The drugs found in his possession were not for distribution, they were for self-medication. He's been struggling with his condition, trying to cope with the nightmares, the flashbacks, the overwhelming sense of despair." Marcus stood motionless, a perfect soldier in a courtroom that felt more like a battlefield. His hands were clasped behind his back, shoulders squared as he waited for the inevitable. He had nothing to add. He knew what he had done. He had been found with a small amount of cocaine during a routine traffic stop. The substance wasn't for sale, it was his way of coping when the prescribed medications didn't work. When the memories of war consumed him, when he was unable to escape the past. The law didn't care about those details. The law didn't care about the reasons. Judge Harrison's gaze never wavered from the file in front of him. He flipped through Marcus's military record, noting the commendations and the honorable discharge. Then he turned to the arrest report, 3.5 grams of cocaine. The words drug possession stood out like a scar. The judge paused for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Harrison said, his voice steady and authoritative. "Your service to this country is noted and appreciated. However, the law is clear regarding possession of controlled substances. Your attorney has requested clemency based on your military service and medical condition. Do you have anything to add before I make my decision?" Marcus cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and controlled, but there was a tremor in it that betrayed the emotion he was trying so desperately to suppress. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice rough, "I know what I did was wrong. I'm not making excuses for my actions. But I've been getting help at the VA for the past 6 months. I attend group therapy twice a week. I haven't touched any drugs since my arrest. I'm asking for a chance to continue my treatment instead of going to prison." There was a brief pause. The air in the courtroom felt thick with tension, as though everyone was holding their breath. A VA counselor, who had come to support Marcus, shifted nervously in her seat. She had brought letters from Marcus's therapy group, testimonials about his progress and his role in helping other veterans. But those words, those testimonies, would not sway Judge Harrison. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Marcus. His expression was unchanged, impassive. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Harrison said, his voice hard, "while I sympathize with your situation, this court cannot ignore the law. Your military service is commendable, but it does not place you above the law. Drug possession is a serious offense that undermines the very society you fought to protect. The words hit Marcus like a blow. He had known they were coming, but that didn't make them any easier to hear. His lawyer, David Chin, stood next to him, his shoulders slumping in resignation. He had known the judge's decision was inevitable. "I hereby sentence you to 2 years in state prison," Judge Harrison continued. His voice was firm and unwavering. "You'll have 2 weeks to get your affairs in order before reporting to begin your sentence. This court is adjourned." The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of the hearing. Marcus remained standing, his expression unreadable, though his eyes, for a brief moment, lost their focus. The reality of what had just happened sank in, but he refused to show it. His attorney placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder, but Marcus barely felt it. His mind had already transported him back to Afghanistan, back to the place where he knew what he was fighting for. In that place, in that world, things made sense. Judge Harrison gathered his papers and stood to leave, his role in Marcus's life now completed. Neither of them knew that their paths would cross again, under very different circumstances, in a situation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about justice, mercy, and human nature. 2 weeks passed quickly. It felt like both an eternity and a blink of an eye to Marcus. His small apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign to him, knowing he would soon have to leave it behind. On Wednesday afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills and papers in front of him. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat beside him, now cold. The calendar on the wall showed 13 days marked off with X's. Tomorrow would be his final therapy session at the VA hospital before he had to report to prison. The thought of it made his hands shake slightly. His sister, Sarah, sat across from him, red-eyed from crying earlier, though she tried to hide it. "I'll make sure everything's just like you left it, Marcus," she said, her voice steady, though her face betrayed her worry. 2 years will go by faster than you think." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had heard those words before, from well-meaning people who didn't really understand. His apartment, decorated with photos from his military service and the faces of friends who hadn't made it back, felt like a lifetime ago. He wondered what they would think of him now. Would they be disappointed? Would they understand? The phone rang, breaking the heavy silence. It was Dr. Lisa Chin, his therapist from the VA hospital. Her voice was warm but professional as she reminded him about tomorrow's group session. "We'll also need to discuss transition planning," she said, referring to the plans for his life after prison. Marcus nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice hoarse. Marcus Johnson stood at attention in front of his bedroom mirror, his reflection staring back at him. The blue button-down shirt and khaki pants he wore were civilian clothes, a far cry from his military uniform, but his posture remained unmistakably military, squared shoulders, a straight back, and eyes focused ahead. Even in the privacy of his own home, he couldn't shake the habits drilled into him over years of service. The dark circles under his eyes were a new addition, a result of sleepless nights following the sentencing that had upended his life. Sleep had become harder to come by since the courtroom, the weight of the judge's words lingering in his mind. Despite the uncertainty that surrounded him, Marcus stood in his room as if it were another day at boot camp, trying to maintain the discipline that had always defined him. He had been given 2 weeks to get his affairs in order before he would have to report to prison, a sentence that felt as surreal as it did harsh. His military training was both a source of strength and a prison in itself, forcing him to adhere to an unrelenting standard even when the world around him felt like it was falling apart. As he finished his morning routine, preparing for the day's therapy session, he grabbed his phone and dialed the number Dr. Chen had left on his voicemail. "I'll be there at 10 a.m. sharp," he said, his voice flat and firm, as though the simple declaration of time was an order to be followed with precision. There was no hesitation in his response. It was a reflex, the military bearing that had never left him, even as he stood on the precipice of an uncertain future. Marcus hung up the phone and walked to his bedroom closet, pulling on the same civilian clothes he had worn the previous day. They felt strange against his skin, but there was no escaping the fact that his life was shifting into a realm of normalcy he could never truly embrace. He hadn't wanted to face the civilian world when he returned from Afghanistan, and now it was something he couldn't outrun. Standing before the mirror, he was reminded that his reflection had become a strange version of himself. A man who had been shaped by war and the rigid discipline of military life, now trying to adjust to a new reality that didn't seem to care about the sacrifices he had made. Later that evening, Marcus made his way to the local veterans support group at the community center. It was a place where he felt at least a semblance of camaraderie, surrounded by other men and women who had been through their own hell. The room was familiar, the classic chairs arranged in a circle, the flicker of fluorescent lights overhead, and the faint smell of cheap coffee coming from the corner table. 8 other veterans were there, each carrying the heavy weight of their own experiences. Some looked much older than they were, the toll of war evident in the lines of their faces, while others seemed trapped in a cycle of quiet rage, their eyes haunted by things that would never be spoken aloud. As the group settled into their circle, Mike, a former Marine who had been coming for over a year, leaned forward. "I just can't believe Judge Harrison didn't take your service into account," he said, his voice filled with frustration. 3 tours, man. That should count for something. Marcus shook his head slowly, the bitterness of the words still lingering in his chest. "The law is the law," he replied quietly, his voice betraying a note of weariness. "I made a mistake. Now I have to pay for it." It was a simple statement, but it was the truth. He had been caught with drugs during a routine traffic stop, and now he was facing 2 years in prison. No amount of medals, no number of tours could change that. Tom Wilson, the group facilitator, leaned forward in his chair. He was a tall, middle-aged man who had been guiding the group for years, and his calm demeanor had always been a source of comfort for Marcus. "You're a real asset to this group, Marcus," Tom said, his voice steady. "The way you help other vets talk through their struggles, that's a gift. Have you considered continuing your peer support work while you're inside?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He hadn't considered that possibility, but the idea struck him with such force that he could almost feel it resonate in his chest. He had always been a natural leader, even before he became a veteran, and he had found a sense of purpose in helping others. Maybe there was a way to make something meaningful out of his sentence, something that could bring him back to himself, even if only for a short while. The thought of turning his prison sentence into a chance to help other incarcerated veterans was a concept he had never considered before. It offered a small flicker of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. That night, back in his apartment, Marcus pulled out his journal, something Dr. Chen had encouraged him to keep for months. He had written about his fears, his hopes, and his determination to stay strong, though sometimes it felt like he was writing into the void. The pages of the journal were filled with his precise handwriting, the kind of penmanship that came from years of military training. It was a habit he had never been able to break, writing mission reports, keeping records, documenting everything in careful detail. He wrote about the trial, the judge's decision, and the path that lay ahead of him. He wrote about the overwhelming sense of guilt that consumed him, the sense that he had let down not only his country but himself. The television played softly in the background, some local news report about increased security measures at the VA hospital due to recent incidents. Marcus barely registered it. His focus was entirely on his writing, trying to process the events of the past few weeks in any way he could. Just as he finished jotting down his final thoughts for the night, there was a knock at the door. Startled, Marcus stood up, his military instincts kicking in. He hadn't expected anyone, and his mind instantly began to assess the situation. His neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had always been kind to him, stood in the doorway. She had a covered dish of homemade enchiladas in her hands. "You need to eat well before you go," she said simply, pressing the warm dish into his hands. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected any kind of gesture like this, and the simple act of kindness made his chest tighten. It was moments like this that reminded him that there was more to life than the struggles he faced. Sometimes, it wasn't the grand gestures that mattered, but the small, quiet acts of humanity that meant everything. As he prepared for bed that night, Marcus went through his evening routine with military precision. He laid out his clothes for tomorrow's therapy session, double-checked his alarm, and performed the breathing exercises he had learned to help manage his PTSD symptoms. His mind was still whirling, but he tried to calm himself. He looked out of the window at the quiet street below, his thoughts returning to Judge Harrison's words in the courtroom. The judge had seen him only as a criminal, a man who had broken the law. Marcus wondered if the judge had ever truly understood what veterans like him went through, what it felt like to carry the weight of war long after the battle was over. He thought of the years he had spent serving his country, the lives he had saved, and the comrades he had lost. In that moment, Marcus wished he could somehow make the judge understand. But for now, he had to focus on getting through one day at a time, counting down to when he would have to trade his freedom for a prison cell. The next morning, Tuesday, arrived with dark clouds hanging low over the city. Marcus pulled into the VA hospital parking lot at 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes early as always. He sat in his old Ford pickup truck for a moment, watching as people hurried inside to escape the approaching rain. The VA hospital was a six-story brick building that had seen better days. Marcus knew every crack in its walls, every squeak of its automatic doors. For the past 6 months, it had become his second home. But today, as he walked across the parking lot, something felt different. There was an odd tension in the air, a heaviness that went beyond the coming storm. As he walked through the main entrance, Marcus noticed more security guards than usual. 2 uniformed men stood near the entrance, speaking in low voices, their eyes scanning the area with an intensity that made Marcus instinctively go on alert. His military training had always made him naturally observant of such changes, but he pushed the concern aside. It was probably just a routine security upgrade. Inside the lobby, the usual morning crowd bustled around, elderly veterans in wheelchairs, nurses in colorful scrubs, and doctors carrying coffee cups. Marcus signed in at the front desk, where Jenny, the regular receptionist, gave him a sad smile. She knew he would be leaving for prison soon, and the look in her eyes confirmed it. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," Jenny said, handing him his visitor badge. "Dr. Chin is running a few minutes late. She asked if you could wait in the main lobby." Marcus nodded and made his way to a seat near the large windows. He pulled out his phone to check his messages. His sister, Sarah, had texted him, "Call me after your session. Love you, big brother." Marcus smiled slightly, the warmth of her message offering a small comfort. Then he noticed a group of well-dressed people walking through the lobby. Among them was Judge William Harrison. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he saw the judge. In civilian clothes, his black robes replaced by a gray suit and a briefcase in hand. The judge was walking with several hospital administrators, heading toward the conference room for the monthly Veterans Advisory Board meeting, as Tom Wilson, his group therapy facilitator, explained beside him. "Ironic, isn't it?" Tom said, his voice low. Before Marcus could respond, movement near the entrance caught his eye. A man entered, wearing a worn military jacket. There was something off about him. His eyes darted around wildly, and his hands kept touching his jacket pocket. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Marcus's combat-trained instincts kicked in. The man's erratic movements and nervous behavior set off a warning bell in his mind. As the man approached the security desk, the guard asked him to sign in, but the man ignored the request, moving forward with increasing agitation. His body language was screaming danger. Marcus's attention was now entirely focused on the man. The usual sounds of the lobby faded away as the tension in the room mounted. The situation was about to escalate, and Marcus could feel it in his bones. Marcus could hear the thud of his own heartbeat, slow and deliberate, as though the pounding was resonating in every corner of his body. His military training kicked in, amplifying his senses to an almost unnatural degree. The world around him seemed to shrink into sharp focus, and he found himself noticing the smallest details with clarity. The man's trembling hands, the frayed laces on his military boots, the bulge in his jacket that shouldn't have been there. Every movement the man made, every shift in his posture, seemed to echo the tension in the air. Marcus's mind raced as he processed the situation with the precision that had been drilled into him over years of service. Outside the building, thunder cracked in the sky, a deafening boom that made several people in the lobby jump. The storm's arrival was almost symbolic, the chaos of nature matching the rising tension inside the VA hospital. At that moment, the man in the worn military jacket, a figure that Marcus now instinctively pegged as a veteran, pulled something from his jacket pocket. A glint of metal reflected under the sterile fluorescent lights, catching Marcus's trained eye. His body tensed, every muscle coiled as his mind locked onto the emerging danger. His eyes flicked to the group of people near the conference room, Judge Harrison among them, oblivious to what was unfolding in the lobby. The security guards stationed at the entrance were too far away to respond in time. The whole scene was unfolding in a way that no one could have predicted. Time itself seemed to stretch and slow, as though the building was holding its breath. Marcus's gaze didn't leave the man's erratic movements. His finger twitched, and Marcus's experience told him that this man wasn't just acting out in anger or frustration. This was a situation built on desperation, a dangerous kind of pain that only someone with deep combat experience could understand. Marcus's gut told him that this wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a man who had crossed the threshold of his own internal war, a war that now had a deadly expression. Dr. Chen's voice, calling Marcus's name, echoed distantly. He barely registered it. His focus was entirely on the man in the military jacket, the gun now clearly visible in his shaking hand. The man's wild eyes darted across the room, his movements erratic as though the world was closing in on him. Marcus remained still, perfectly frozen in place as the world around him seemed to shift into slow motion. His mind was assessing the situation, running through every possible scenario, weighing his options. This man was a fellow veteran, a man who had fought the same battles as Marcus. But now the roles had shifted. Marcus wasn't just a bystander. He was in the midst of a crisis. The man's behavior was erratic, and it was clear that he was operating under the stress of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. His actions screamed of someone who had been broken by the weight of war, someone who had been failed by the system that was supposed to protect him. Marcus could see the signs. He had witnessed them in others during therapy sessions, in the eyes of his fellow veterans who had lost themselves to the same darkness. The man's finger twitched again, his gun raised, and a moment later, the sound of 2 shots filled the room, echoing through the building. The noise was deafening, like a bomb exploding in the quiet morning. The shot reverberated in the walls, followed by the sounds of screams and panic. People began running in all directions, desperate to escape the situation, but the man's voice rang out, cracking with emotion and fear. "Don't move," he shouted, his voice a mixture of anger, fear, and pain. "Everybody move. Get in the conference room now." Marcus's body remained still, his mind processing the situation like a well-oiled machine. The man's gun was now directed at the group of people near the conference room. Marcus watched as they were herded, forced into the room by this desperate man. His eyes moved quickly to assess the hostages, 12 people in total, Judge Harrison for members of the advisory board, 3 hospital staff, and 4 civilians who had been in the lobby. The situation had escalated quickly, and Marcus knew that the next few moments would be crucial. From his position behind a large potted plant, Marcus had a clear view through the conference room's glass walls. He could see Judge Harrison's face, his usual stern demeanor replaced by visible shock and fear. For a brief moment their eyes locked, and Marcus saw the flicker of recognition in the judge's gaze. It was as though Harrison was seeing Marcus for the first time as a person, not as the defendant he had sentenced to prison just 2 weeks ago. The judge's face had transformed from a figure of authority into one of helplessness, the walls of his courtroom now far removed from the chaos of this moment. Inside the conference room, papers were scattered across the table, the morning meeting completely disrupted. The hostages, now seated around the table, were following the man's orders, placing their phones on the table in front of them. Marcus could see the judge helping a frail, elderly veteran in a wheelchair, ensuring that the man followed the instructions to place his phone down. Outside the building, sirens wailed, signaling the arrival of the police. Marcus had no doubt that some of the panic had triggered the silent alarm, and the authorities were on their way. The sound of the sirens seemed to increase the tension in the room. Cooper, the man holding the gun, snapped his head toward the noise, his agitation visibly growing. His voice rose, desperate and pleading as he paced back and forth, his fingers twitching on the gun's trigger. "They don't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking. "None of you understand." His eyes darted around the room, the pain and frustration clear in his every movement. 3 times. 3 times I asked for help and they denied my claims. Do you know what that's like? Do you know what it feels like to be forgotten?" Marcus's gaze shifted to the floor near Cooper's feet. Scattered among the papers were the unmistakable forms of VA benefit denial letters. It became clear to Marcus that this wasn't just a random attack, it was the result of a man pushed to the brink, a veteran who had been failed by the very system that was supposed to care for him. Cooper wasn't just angry, he was broken, crushed by the weight of bureaucracy and ignored claims. His actions were a desperate plea for recognition, for acknowledgement of the suffering that he had endured, and for the recognition of his humanity. Outside, the first police cars arrived, their flashing lights painting the walls in a chaotic mix of red and blue. Marcus could see the flashing lights reflected in the conference room's glass. The storm outside had only worsened, the rain pounding against the windows, thunder crashing with increasing intensity. Inside the room, Cooper was getting more agitated by the second. His finger tightened on the trigger, and Marcus could feel the tension building like a dam ready to burst. "Stay back," Cooper yelled when Judge Harrison attempted to rise from his seat. "You're all the same. Sitting in your offices, making decisions about our lives. Do you know what it's like? Do you know what we see when we close our eyes?" The desperation in Cooper's voice was unmistakable, and Marcus recognized the signs of a PTSD episode. He had seen it in the eyes of so many veterans in the support group, men and women who had experienced the horrors of war and had never been able to fully process them. The difference now was that Cooper's desperation had turned deadly. The man's finger was twitching on the trigger, and Marcus could sense that the situation was reaching a boiling point. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Marcus's mind raced, but his body stayed still. He was in the perfect position to do something, but the risks were enormous. He could slip away, leave the building, and let the police handle the situation. After all, he was just days away from his own sentence. He had no obligation to stay, no reason to put himself in harm's way. But as the storm raged outside and the chaos intensified inside, Marcus made a decision. He had sworn an oath when he joined the military, an oath to protect and serve, to defend the lives of others. That oath hadn't ended when he took off his uniform, and it wouldn't end just because he had been sentenced to prison. The storm outside may have been a symbol of the chaos unfolding in the building, but it also fueled Marcus's determination to act. With slow, deliberate movements, Marcus began to edge closer to the conference room. He knew that the next few moments would be crucial. His military training kicked in as he carefully evaluated his options. This was his chance to make things right, to save lives, including those of the judge and the other hostages who had been caught in this terrible situation. There was no turning back now. Marcus Johnson knew that the lives of 12 people, including Judge Harrison, depended on his actions. And he wasn't going to let them down. Outside, the storm continued to rage, a fierce tempest that seemed to match the intensity of the crisis unfolding within the walls of the VA hospital. Lightning occasionally illuminated the scene, casting fleeting flashes of light on the chaos inside. The distant sound of thunder, loud and persistent, rumbled like an ominous drumbeat, only adding to the mounting tension. Through the glass windows of the conference room, Marcus could see James Cooper, the man holding the room of hostages at gunpoint, growing more unstable by the minute. The veteran's once pristine military jacket was soaked through with sweat, his breathing shallow and erratic. His eyes, wild and unfocused, darted constantly between the terrified hostages and the lobby beyond, as though searching for an escape or perhaps a way to make sense of the turmoil he was feeling inside. His hands shook uncontrollably, and the gun he held never seemed to stay pointed in one direction for long, as if the weapon itself was just as uncertain as its wielder. It was a dangerous situation, and Marcus knew it was only going to get worse. Marcus had carefully positioned himself behind a tall filing cabinet about 20 feet from the conference room door. From this vantage point he had a clear view of the entire room through the glass walls, and he could see everything that was happening. He watched Judge Harrison sitting at the far end of the conference table, his suit jacket discarded and his tie loosened. The judge was trying to maintain his composure, but it was clear that the reality of the situation was beginning to settle in. Every so often, Harrison would glance in Marcus's direction, their eyes meeting briefly, a silent exchange of recognition between the two men. Marcus could sense the judge's growing realization that, for the first time in his life, he was powerless in this situation, no longer the one giving orders, but the one waiting for a resolution that was out of his hands. Cooper's voice cut through the tension, shaking with raw emotion as he addressed the room but spoke more to himself. "You know what it's like," he said, his voice quivering. "The nightmares don't stop. The sounds don't stop. And they just keep saying, fill out more forms. More papers. More waiting." Marcus watched him closely, his combat instincts in full gear. He could see the subtle signs in Cooper's behavior, the way his left hand kept touching his ear, the way he flinched every time thunder cracked outside. These were signs that Marcus knew all too well from his own experiences, both in combat and in therapy. The PTSD symptoms were unmistakable. Marcus had seen them before in his therapy group, fellow veterans who had been broken by the war, haunted by memories that never seemed to fade. He knew the signs of severe PTSD, the hypervigilance, the erratic movements, the triggers that could send someone spiraling into an emotional breakdown. Cooper's pain was palpable, but it wasn't just that. It was also the anger of a man who had fought for his country and now felt abandoned by the very system that was supposed to help him. A young woman sitting at the conference table, an administrative assistant perhaps, was starting to panic. Her breath was coming in short, ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling in quick succession. Her eyes were wide with fear, and it was becoming clear to everyone in the room that she was having a panic attack. Marcus could see the distress on her face, and his attention was momentarily diverted from Cooper's growing instability. Judge Harrison, with a calmness that seemed almost out of place in the midst of the chaos, slowly raised his hand. He spoke with a steady voice, his words cutting through the thick air of tension. "Mr. Cooper," Harrison said, his tone even, "one of our people needs medical attention. Please, let's handle this reasonably." Marcus watched as Cooper spun toward the judge, his gun hand shaking, his face contorting with anger and disbelief. "Reasonably?" Cooper spat, his voice rising in agitation. Like how you handled veterans in your courtroom. I know who you are, Judge Harrison. You signed those papers too, sending us away instead of getting us help? The words hit the judge hard. Marcus could see the change in Harrison's face, the way the color drained from his features as the full weight of Cooper's accusation settled in. For perhaps the first time, Harrison was seeing the direct consequences of the decisions he had made from behind the bench. He was no longer in a position of power. He was now the one facing the consequences of a system that had failed someone who had once served his country. Harrison's eyes met Marcus's again, this time holding the gaze longer than before. There was a quiet understanding in the judge's expression, a recognition that they were both part of a complex, broken reality. Outside the building, the police negotiator's voice boomed over a megaphone, trying once again to communicate with Cooper, but his words were drowned out by Cooper's frantic shouting. Quiet! Cooper screamed, his voice filled with frustration. You don't understand? Marcus could hear the desperation in Cooper's voice, the sense of being cornered, of having no one left to turn to. He could see the young woman's breathing getting worse, her panic escalating by the second. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair, perhaps one of Cooper's comrades from the war, reached out for her hand, trying to offer some comfort. But Cooper's eyes snapped to the man, his face twisted with rage, and he shouted for the elderly veteran to stay still. Marcus knew that the situation was deteriorating. Cooper's finger was growing tighter on the trigger, his movements more erratic, and the hostages were becoming more frightened. Fear could be contagious and it could make people do dangerous things. The tension was palpable, and every second seemed to stretch on indefinitely as Marcus studied Cooper's every move, trying to find a way to reach him. He noticed something others might have missed, how Cooper favored his right leg slightly, the occasional twitch in his shoulder. These were signs of an injury, something that was likely the result of an IED blast. Marcus recognized the signs of an IED survivor. It was something he knew all too well. Judge Harrison, meanwhile, was watching Marcus, his expression showing a mix of hope and uncertainty. Marcus could see it in the judge's eyes. He was recognizing him not just as a defendant, but as a fellow veteran. It was ironic, really. The roles had completely reversed. 2 weeks ago it was Harrison who had sentenced Marcus, and now Marcus was the one who could potentially save them all. The weight of that irony wasn't lost on either of them, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered now was finding a way to defuse this situation before it became a bloodbath. Marcus's mind raced through his options. He knew that he could probably slip away unnoticed. The police had already evacuated most of the building, and no one would blame him for leaving. After all, his prison sentence was looming in just a matter of days. But every time he considered escaping, his military training kicked in. Never leave a man behind. It was an oath he had sworn to uphold, and it didn't end just because he was facing a prison sentence. It didn't end because he was now on the other side of the law. Suddenly, Cooper grabbed a stack of papers from the conference table and began reading them aloud. Marcus could hear the emotion in his voice as he read the dates, the reference numbers, the cold, impersonal language of rejection. These were his denied VA claims, documents that had been processed and filed only to be ignored by the system. As Cooper read the papers aloud, his voice cracked, his emotions raw. In that moment, Marcus saw Judge Harrison's face change again. For the first time, the judge wasn't hearing the cold, bureaucratic language of a legal system. He was hearing the human story behind the papers, the story of a man who had fought for his country and now found himself begging for help that never came. The human cost of the decisions Harrison had made behind the bench was now laid bare in front of him. Thunder cracked particularly loud outside, and Cooper spun toward the windows, his gun hand jerking as the loud noise seemed to rattle him further. In that brief moment of distraction, Judge Harrison mouthed something to Marcus. It was barely perceptible, but it was unmistakable. "Help us," he said silently. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He knew what he had to do. He could feel the storm outside, but inside, an even more intense storm was about to break. This was the moment where everything would either fall apart or be salvaged. He needed to reach Cooper, to calm him down, to connect with him on a level that no one else could. But he couldn't do it by threatening him or making him feel cornered. He had to reach Cooper not as a hostage negotiator, but as a fellow veteran who understood the pain, the frustration, and the hopelessness. Taking one final breath, Marcus stepped out from behind the filing cabinet, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, showing that he wasn't armed. He called out softly, using the familiar greeting of soldiers, the one that carried with it the unspoken bond of shared experiences. "Remember me from group therapy, Cooper?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Cooper spun around, his gun hand shaking violently. Stay back. Don't come any closer, he shouted, panic in his eyes. I'm not moving, Marcus replied, his voice steady. I just want to talk. Veteran to veteran. He kept his voice calm, knowing that the slightest misstep could make everything worse. You were with the 3rd Infantry Division, right? I can tell from your jacket patch. He paused, taking another small step forward. I know you survived an IED. Probably near FUA, am I right? For a brief moment, Cooper's eyes widened, his gun hand lowering slightly. The recognition was in his eyes, but it wasn't fear, it was the understanding that someone here might actually know what he had been through. Someone might actually understand. Yeah, I was there, Cooper muttered, his voice wavering. I've been there too, Marcus said, his voice low and steady. He took another small step forward, closing the distance between them. 2 years ago I was sitting right where you are, angry and hurting, feeling like nobody understood. But I got out. I'm still here. He glanced briefly at Judge Harrison, who was watching the scene unfold with bated breath. You're not alone in this, Marcus continued, his voice firm but empathetic. I've got scars too. From an IED just like you. Same hell. Different place. Cooper's eyes shifted between Marcus and the judge. His grip on the gun tightened for a moment before loosening slightly. The storm inside him hadn't dissipated, but Marcus could feel the tiniest shift, the first crack in Cooper's emotional armor. They keep denying my claims, Cooper said suddenly, his voice cracking. 3 times. Do you know what it's like to beg for help and get nothing but more paperwork? Marcus nodded slowly. I know. That's exactly why I ended up where I am now, he said, gesturing to his leg, which bore the physical reminders of the war. I tried to quiet the noise in my head the only way I knew how. Drugs. I got caught and now I'm facing prison. 2 weeks from now I'm heading in. Cooper's eyes darted to the judge, then back to Marcus. But you're always so together in group. Always helping others. Marcus let out a long breath. Nobody's got it all together, brother, he said softly. We just learned to carry the weight better. He met Cooper's gaze, holding it steady. Remember what Dr. Chin tells us in group? The weight doesn't get lighter. We just get stronger. The words seemed to settle in the air between them. Cooper's gun hand lowered, his body language shifting as if he was finally starting to hear what Marcus was saying. Thunder rumbled outside, but this time Cooper didn't flinch. The storm, for the first time in a long while, seemed to quiet. The rain outside had subsided, its fury easing into a gentle drizzle that left the sky streaked with gray clouds, while the sound of distant sirens and the faint hum of news vans pulling up to the building filled the air. Inside the conference room, the storm of tension and fear had calmed, though an unspoken weight lingered in the room. Marcus stood there, his adrenaline ebbing, the hard edge of the crisis slowly dissolving into the reality of what had just transpired. He felt the weight of the moment, a mixture of relief and exhaustion sweeping over him. Cooper, the man who had been moments away from spiraling into an irreversible breakdown, was now being gently escorted from the room. His sobs had quieted, but his body still trembled from the emotional release. Marcus had held him through it all, never wavering, never leaving his side. It was a promise kept, a bond forged not in the heat of battle, but in the shared agony of understanding. As the last of the hostages were ushered out, Marcus exchanged brief glances with some of them, expressions of gratitude, of relief, but also of lingering fear. One young woman who had suffered a panic attack earlier passed him as she was escorted to an awaiting ambulance. She reached out to squeeze his shoulder, a simple but powerful gesture of thanks. Marcus gave her a brief nod, his gaze following her as she was taken outside. She would be okay and so would the others. He had done his job, perhaps not the job he was trained for, but the job that had mattered most in that moment. The SWAT team was still moving through the building, securing areas, ensuring the safety of the remaining personnel. Medical teams rushed in, their presence a welcome sight for everyone, though the real work was done. The adrenaline had drained from Marcus's body, leaving only the heavy presence of reality. His own fate loomed large again, the prison sentence that awaited him in just 2 weeks like a shadow over everything. He had hoped that somehow this act of saving lives would have made some difference, but the law was the law and there was no escaping it. Judge Harrison remained in the conference room, standing just outside the immediate chaos, watching everything unfold with a quiet intensity. He hadn't moved from his spot since Cooper had dropped the gun, though his eyes never left Marcus. There was a new understanding in his gaze, something that hadn't been there before. The judge had seen countless cases, seen men and women from all walks of life walk through his courtroom, each one a story of pain, triumph, or failure. But this This moment, this raw act of compassion and understanding was different. It was a reminder that justice wasn't just about the law, it was about humanity. As the SWAT officers led Cooper from the room, still in handcuffs but now with the understanding that he was heading to a psychiatric ward and not a jail cell, Marcus's focus shifted back to Judge Harrison. The judge was standing there, his expression thoughtful, perhaps even conflicted. The role reversal wasn't lost on Marcus. 2 weeks ago, it had been Harrison who had sentenced him, and now it was Marcus who had saved him. The law had failed Cooper and it had failed Marcus too, but in that moment, Marcus had made a choice that transcended the law. He had chosen empathy, understanding, and humanity. The soft click of the door behind Marcus signaled the end of the operation. The hostages were safe, Cooper was in good hands, and Marcus had done what he had set out to do. But there was still the matter of what came next. The next few weeks were going to be difficult, to say the least, and his life would take a turn he couldn't predict. But in that moment, the weight of his sentence felt less pressing. The lives saved here today were worth more than any prison sentence, more than any legal ruling. And yet, the knowledge that he would soon be behind bars wasn't entirely gone. It had been put on pause, but it would be waiting for him when the dust settled. Judge Harrison took a step toward him, his voice cutting through the quiet room. "Marcus," he began, his tone steady but with a noticeable shift. "What you did today, what you've done for these people, goes beyond what I've seen in 20 years on the bench." Marcus blinked, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to receiving such praise, especially from someone who had just sentenced him. His eyes met the judge's, the weight of those words sinking in. "Sir," Marcus replied, his voice still steady despite the sudden surge of emotion. "I just did what needed doing." Harrison's gaze hardened with purpose as he continued, "No, Marcus. You did something far more than that. What you did today wasn't just about protecting lives or diffusing a dangerous situation. You showed more wisdom, more compassion, and more understanding of human nature than I've ever seen from the men and women who have stood before me. You understood exactly what that man needed. You spoke his language, you understood his pain. And in doing so, you saved everyone in this room." For a moment, Marcus stood there, absorbing the weight of Harrison's words. They felt heavy but oddly comforting. It was strange, hearing this from a man who had once held his fate in his hands. There was an undeniable sense of irony in the way the roles had shifted. 2 weeks ago, Marcus had been the defendant, and now he was the one who had saved the judge, saved everyone in the room simply by being who he was. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus wondered if maybe there was more to his life than the prison sentence awaiting him. "I didn't do it for you, Judge," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. "I did it for him. And for all of them." He motioned toward the now empty room, the hostages gone, the SWAT team still securing the building. "I just didn't want to see another man like me get lost in the system." Harrison's eyes softened, and he gave a slow nod. "Maybe that's the real issue here," he murmured. "Maybe the system has failed all of you, all of us. I've seen so many veterans come through my courtroom, and I never truly understood the toll it took on them. The pain they carry, the weight of their experiences. I made decisions based on the law, based on what I thought was right. But today you've shown me something different." Marcus felt his own weight shift at the judge's words. It was a quiet acknowledgement, an understanding of a truth that had been lost somewhere in the cold bureaucracy of the court system. For the first time, Judge Harrison seemed to realize that the law wasn't always the answer, that sometimes true justice meant seeing beyond the paperwork and the rules, and truly understanding the person standing before you. "I don't know what I can do now, Marcus," Harrison said, his voice almost apologetic. "But I do know this: what I've done so far hasn't been enough. The law is important, yes, but it isn't everything. Maybe it's time for me to reevaluate how I approach my work, how I judge the people who come before me." Marcus stared at the judge, his own thoughts clouded with uncertainty. He didn't know what the future held for him, whether Harrison's words would translate into real change or if it was just another empty promise. But in that moment there was a glimmer of something that felt a little like hope. "What you did today, Marcus," Harrison continued, his voice firm with newfound conviction, "wasn't just a decision based on the law. You made a decision based on humanity. And I have to ask myself which approach serves justice better. The law or understanding the people we're supposed to protect?" Marcus stood tall, the weight of his military bearing coming back to him. "The law is the law," he said firmly. "You did your job." Harrison smiled softly, though there was a hint of regret in his eyes. "Perhaps, Marcus. But maybe my job needs to include a deeper understanding of the people who stand before me." The room grew quiet again, save for the distant hum of police radios and the sounds of the storm passing overhead. Outside, the sky was breaking open, the first rays of sunlight peeking through the clouds, as if nature itself were acknowledging the shift in the air. Marcus didn't know what would come next. The system had failed him, but maybe, just maybe, he had found a way to make it right. For himself, for Cooper, for all the veterans like them who had been forgotten by the very system that was meant to help them. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The room was more crowded than usual, news of the events at the VA hospital having spread quickly throughout the community. The mood was different today, charged with a quiet anticipation. Marcus Johnson stood at the defendant's table once again, though this time he was not alone. Behind him, his supporters had gathered in full force. Dr. Chin from the VA hospital sat in the front row, his usual calm demeanor now edged with a nervous energy. Several veterans from Marcus's therapy group were there as well, their faces showing a mixture of hope and apprehension. The young woman who had suffered the panic attack during the hostage situation was seated with her family in the rows behind, her presence a testament to the healing Marcus had helped begin. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, his elderly neighbor, had come, holding the empty dish she had brought over with her last batch of enchiladas, a familiar, comforting gesture despite the gravity of the occasion. At exactly 9 a.m., the voice of the court clerk echoed through the room. "All rise." The Honorable Judge William Harrison presiding. The crowd stood as Judge Harrison entered the room. His black robes flowed behind him, but there was something different in his demeanor today. The stern mask of judicial authority that Marcus had grown accustomed to seeing, the impersonal, detached demeanor of the man who had sentenced him to prison just weeks ago, had softened. It was still there, but it was underlined by something else, a certain wisdom, a sense of reflection. He was no longer simply a judge enforcing the law. He was a man who had been forced to reconsider his own understanding of justice. "Please be seated," Judge Harrison said, his voice steady as he adjusted his reading glasses. He looked around the room, acknowledging the presence of everyone who had gathered. There was no air of formality today, it was as if the case at hand had evolved into something far larger than just a legal matter. "We are here today to review the case of Marcus Johnson in light of new evidence regarding his character and rehabilitation." Marcus stood tall at the defendant's table, his military bearing as intact as ever, though his heart was pounding in his chest. His public defender, David Chin, was seated beside him, his usual stoic composure replaced by a slight, barely noticeable smile. It was clear that things had changed. Marcus didn't know whether it was hope or disbelief that was rising within him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like something was shifting in his favor. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Harrison began, his voice taking on a more reflective tone. "3 weeks ago, I sentenced you to 2 years in state prison for drug possession. I made that decision based on the law as it stood before me, without fully considering the human element of your case." He paused, his gaze settling on Marcus with a weight that seemed to carry more than just the legal implications. "Last week, you taught me the cost of such oversight." The room held its collective breath as the judge picked up a stack of papers from his bench. The sound of the pages rustling was loud in the silence that had settled over the courtroom. "I have here several documents," the judge continued, his voice unwavering, but tinged with something like respect. "First, a detailed report from the VA hospital about your actions during the crisis." He paused, allowing the room to absorb that piece of information. "Second, statements from all 12 hostages, including myself, testifying to your extraordinary courage and wisdom in handling the situation." Marcus stood straight, his posture unwavering as his mind began to process the words. The judge was speaking as if Marcus had done something far more than what was expected of him. The morning light now filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor, and for a moment, Marcus felt like he was back in the field, the weight of his uniform heavy on his shoulders, but also grounding him in the present. This wasn't about the law anymore, this was something else. "The most compelling," Judge Harrison continued, "is this letter from James Cooper, written from the VA psychiatric ward." The judge held up the letter, pausing for a moment as if weighing its significance before looking directly at Marcus. "Would you like to hear what he wrote?" Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight. He nodded silently, unable to speak as the room waited in tense anticipation. The judge unfolded the letter and began to read aloud, his voice steady as he relayed James Cooper's words. "Marcus Johnson saved more than just lives that day. He saved my soul. He showed me that someone could understand my pain without judging me. He proved that the uniform we wore wasn't just something we put on, it was something we carry inside us forever." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as the words sank in. He didn't know if he had ever truly believed that his actions that day could mean so much to someone. It had been about survival, about doing what he knew had to be done to prevent more bloodshed. But now, hearing Cooper's words, the depth of what he had done hit him like a wave. He had made a difference not just in the lives of the people in that room, but in one man's struggle to reclaim his sense of self. The judge set down the letter and removed his glasses, his eyes meeting Marcus's with a new understanding. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Harrison said, his voice quieter now but no less resolute, "the law exists to serve justice. But sometimes justice requires us to look deeper than just the letter of the law." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the audience digested the judge's words. Marcus felt his heart beat faster, unsure of what was coming next but unwilling to look away from the judge. "Your original crime was serious," the judge continued, "self-medicating with illegal substances cannot be overlooked. However, your actions last week demonstrated something profound about your character and your ongoing rehabilitation." He paused, his gaze never leaving Marcus. "You had every reason to walk away that day. I had shown you no mercy, yet you chose to help others, including myself, at great personal risk. More importantly, you showed remarkable understanding and compassion in dealing with a fellow veteran in crisis." Marcus swallowed again, the emotion rising in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He stood firm, his eyes locked on the judge's, waiting for the next words to come. "Therefore," Judge Harrison announced, his voice clear and unwavering, "I am modifying your sentence. The 2-year prison term is suspended. Instead, you will serve 2 years of probation, during which time you will continue your PTSD treatment at the VA hospital." The room gasped collectively and Marcus's legs almost gave way beneath him. He didn't dare to move, his body trembling with the rush of relief that flooded him. He had never thought this would be possible. He had expected prison, expected to disappear behind bars, to be forgotten. But now here he was, standing in a courtroom not as a criminal, but as a man being given a second chance. "And," Judge Harrison added, his voice carrying a new weight, "as part of your probation, you will work with the VA hospital's Veteran Outreach Program. Your insight and ability to connect with struggling veterans is too valuable to waste behind bars." Tears sprang to Marcus's eyes as the room erupted into applause. Sarah, his sister, was already rushing toward him, arms outstretched, ready to embrace him. But for Marcus, the most powerful moment came when his eyes met Judge Harrison's. There was a look between them, one of mutual respect and understanding. In that moment, neither man needed to say anything. They had both learned something profound about justice, about mercy, and about the humanity that sometimes gets lost in the system. The judge raised his gavel, and the sound of it striking the wood echoed through the room. "This court hereby orders the modified sentence into effect immediately. And Mr. Johnson," the judge added, his voice softer now, a small smile curling at the corners of his lips, "thank you for teaching an old judge that true justice requires both wisdom and mercy." The room was filled with applause, some of it muffled by tears, some of it filled with the relief of knowing that Marcus Johnson had been given a chance at redemption, not just for himself, but for all the veterans who had been lost in the system. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom, free at last, he knew that the real work had only just begun. But this time he wouldn't be alone. He had found his purpose again, not just to heal himself but to help others. And in doing so, he would prove that sometimes, the darkest moments can lead to the brightest possibilities for redemption.